Well, hello, everyone. I do recognize some faces, but I see some new faces, so awesome. Thanks for coming. How many are from Meridian? Where's the people that aren't from Meridian? I know you are. And you. Did I tell you I met David?
Really?
David and Arlene and Craig and I had lunch a few weeks ago.
Where at?
Down in LA somewhere, Orange. Yeah, somewhere in, I forget where exactly, but it was finally good to meet him.
I want to meet Arlene.
So we can have an opportunity to quiz you at the end if you go around and have everyone introduce themselves, and then at break we can switch seats and see if you can remember their name.
No, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm not going to necessarily need you guys to introduce yourselves. Most of you know each other already, right? Now, Drew, we've got others coming maybe, or we can get started, right? We don't want to wait. I mean, if food wasn't enough to get them here on time, I don't know what else to do. Okay, so everybody has been using Talend Studio? You're the new guy?
Yeah, I'm one, I did say.
Okay.
We're just kind of observing.
Okay, that's a good thing. Okay, and how many came to the last Detroit users group that I thought so. So we got 3-4 new faces. Awesome. Well, it's great coming back to Detroit. I had a really funny story to share. Getting here last night was very hard from LA for some reason. So I got delayed in Chicago, which isn't that far. 5-hour delay. Finally got here at 12:30 this morning to look up on my app to go to my hotel, get map directions, and it's Windsor, Ontario, Canada, which I can see the frickin' building. It's like, yeah, right over there, that town. The app booked me closest proximity for Marriott. I said, Windsor, okay. I don't know Detroit. That's, like Warren and, yeah. I didn't bring my passport. It's 12:30 in the morning, and I'm going, oh shit, literally. And so I got up on the phone and called them and said, sorry, I'm not going to make it, but I need another room. And so I talked to Global, and I got a room up in Warren. So everything was sold out.
Where is Warren?
It's about 15, 16 miles north, towards Flint.
You're almost Airbnb in it.
So
Right.
the lesson learned for me was next time, even though it's really close and really good price, check to make sure it's still in the US or bring my passport. So I made it. I was worried there. I thought I was going to sleep at the airport this morning, but I got to the hotel about 2:30.
And they won't let you in with the U.S.
No.
license anymore.
Recent change, I don't know how recent, but recent change. I thought, well, gee, can I use my driver's license? So I actually Googled it. And at the bridge entry in the tunnel, you've got to produce a passport.
You can use an enhanced driver's license.
Yeah, but I don't have that.
You don't have to, that's different.
And mine's a California driver's license, so it's, they probably aren't going to accept that either. That's a different border country. Anyway.
It would have been really funny if you'd have went thinking that your driver's license worked and then get stuck on the road. That'd have been
I'm so glad I checked. Well, I do my routine. I got to the airport, I pull up my Marriott app, get directions, then go get the car so I know how long and where I'm going. And hadn't even gotten my bag yet, and I was going, oh shit. I still made it.
Yeah.
It's funny how that works. You eventually get there. One time it took me 18 hours to get to Chicago from Sacramento. It shouldn't happen, but it does. I could have gotten to Paris in that time. All right, so today we're going to be following up on the session we did before, which, as you all know, I've been blogging about job design patterns and best practices in Talend. And I think I shared with you last time that it's a little misleading because I really focused on these sessions on the best practices. And we've been talking about the first 16 best practices in the last session. We're going to cover the next 16 in this session. Unfortunately, none of them are specific to big data, but some of them relate, right? And you can ask questions, and this is a dialogue, so I want you guys to interrupt me and ask questions. But just at that last meeting, I had just released my latest blog on successful methodologies with Talend with job design patterns. And I don't know if any of you had a chance to read that blog yet. No, okay. Well, you should, because I'm starting to really flesh out job design patterns. You know, really, what is the purpose of the use case? How should I lay out a lift and shift? How should I do a migration? How should I do a command line driven job? And this kind of stuff. A dump and a load. You know, all those kinds of patterns are emerging finally. And I'm going to continue to really flesh this out. And my team is going to add more. We have a bunch of best practices now on Spark, which is a very big deal in the big data world. We're now on all three clouds. AWS, Azure, and Google. We're on all the major Hadoop platforms, Cloudera, MapR, and Hortonworks. You can do EMR and others too. So big pushes. We just released 7.01. What version are you guys on? You're on 7.01? Because that was just like in the last 3 weeks ago? There you go. Well, it's 7.0.1. Right. Yeah. So you guys aren't yet though, right?
On our open side,
Oh,
we're just releasing that.
okay, awesome. And I know we're playing with it in Minneapolis with the PEDS group as well as with you guys. Okay, so that was my caveat on all that stuff. Now, is this going to progress forward? Let's see.
How do we get your blog updates? Can we put it in this?
There we go.
Comments or something?
Just go to talend.com, look for the blog link, and they're all right there. And you can search, just look, most of mine are under data integration. They're categorized. And once you find me, then you can find all the blogs that I've written. I've written about all kinds of things, right?
It's not the best UI to get to your blog.
Yeah, that was the new one. And one of the requirements I asked for was, look, on that front page, give a list of the authors, because people know who you are. So I've talked to Jake about that, and he says it's coming. But yeah, like anything, it takes time.
You got to search your Ontology, it's fine.
So what we're gonna do today is I'll give you a quick introduction for those of you who haven't met me. We're gonna really encourage this open conversation. I really prefer that. That's why I like doing this face to face. Don't hesitate to blurt out and interrupt me at any time. We're going to go a little bit into SDLC like we did last time, but I'm going to introduce to you a concept I call DDLC, Database Development Lifecycle. You know, databases need a lifecycle too, and they're often ignored. So I have some interesting concepts to introduce to you. You'll see some that you're probably very familiar with, and then we'll dive into the other 16 best practices. Some of the slides are the same, and I'm going to revisit a few of the best practices from the first session, just as a process of moving forward. Okay, so yeah.
I've been thinking about this a long time, since the first one. So can you provide with an operational definition of what you think SDLC is? Because from what I've done 40 years ago, I mean, SDLC was business design, requirements, business design.
Right.
Tech design, you wrote pseudocode, you developed, you had test.
Very waterfall-ish.
Yeah, very waterfall.
And that's an SDLC best practice. That's one of them. That's a methodology,
Agile,
right?
the terms that you use, I haven't been able to map it into Agile, so you have a wish list of course, you prioritize it, you have users who speak about things that they want,
Yeah.
without getting into the technical stuff. So how do you,
Well, I'd invite you to read that two-part series. It's two-part so far. I'm going to add more on successful methodologies in Talend. I tackle that very question. I talk about waterfall and agile and something I call JEP, just enough process, which is a hybrid. Now, agile is somewhat of a hybrid too, but it's got some very specific ways of thinking. JEP is something my brother and I came up with 20 years ago because JEP, J-E-P, just enough process. Because you need process, but too much gets in the way. So we actually call it JEP plus. So you have just enough process plus a little bit more, so you know you have enough. It's just really corny, but it brings together all the best practices from Agile, from Waterfall, from CMM, ISO 9000, all these kinds of practices out there for software development. And then I've added in JEP things like DDLC, the database definition lifecycle. And I was actually doing the infinity loop in JEP 20 years ago that we now have as a regular DevOps thing. So it covered all of that, and I've started to document it a little bit in my blogs. So read those 2 blogs.
Sounds like you gotta write a book.
That's what everybody tells me. Write a book. I said, right. Well, I write blogs now, and I'm starting to get a little good at it, but it takes a while. It takes me a long while, actually, to write those things. Okay, so I joined Talend January 2015, so about 3.5 years ago. But I actually started using Talend back in 2009, so I'm 9 years now. I'm a database architect and applications developer from way back. I started in COBOL on mini computers. Do you remember what those even are? There's a few out there. AS400, well, I was on Prime computers, right? As of last April, I became the regional manager for the customer success architecture team. So I have a team of 6 other CSAs spread across North America. And this team is designed to fill that gap between technical support and professional services. We're a non-billable resource, but we are very busy people, so we don't really take more than an hour or a day with a customer. And we focus on architecture, best practices, solutions, discussions around the big picture, right? And we do events like this. Any questions about me? Good. I can't emphasize this enough. Please, just jump in anytime, okay? So those who were here last time, remember I like to start out with the question. So the question is, what's the best way for me to write a job in Talend? And I don't care whether you're experienced at Talend or just beginning at Talend, or you're experienced software engineer, if you used one of our competitor tools, doesn't really matter. This question still applies. What's the best way for me to apply this use case, right? And it needs to be these 3 things: easy to read, easy to write, and easy to maintain. And as programmers, we know that's a challenge. You can get 2 out of those 3. So how do you pick the right 2? Ask another question. Will the job change over time? And that's the most likely answer, yes. So prioritize them. Make it maintainable. And in order to be maintainable, it has to be somewhat readable, which means it's going to take you a little bit more time and discipline to write that code. Now, on the other hand, if it's a one-off, one-time deal, you know for a fact you just got to do this and get it out the door, get it done, get it fast, just write the damn thing. You're never going to modify it, right? Right.
I'm going to stop here. I've seen this slide 10 times now over the past year. What do you mean when you say easy to read? What makes it easy to read?
That's a great question. Nobody's asked that question before. Easy to read. So think about a job that you've written 6 months ago.
I have no idea what it does when I open it.
That's the problem. You have to open it up and you have to figure out what it is that you did, which means it's not very readable, right? You coded it quick, which means you took this approach. You didn't spend the time to make it readable by labeling things, by spacing things on the layout so that it's not overlapping and jumbled up.
I use the T-note a lot.
T-note isn't bad. T-note is a good way of documenting your code, right? That's helpful. So just spread it out more. I mean, it's a canvas. Just because you have this much real estate on your screen doesn't mean that how much canvas you have. You have scroll bars. You have zoom in and out. So just make it easier for yourself. But yeah, it's going to take you a little bit of extra work to make that happen.
I suddenly have an idea. You know that now we can talk to phone, talk to text. Why don't we talk to the app and then typing on the note? I always
Put a voice
struggle
in it.
to.
Yeah, okay. Enter a support ticket with a feature request. There you go. I love the idea. Okay, but I'm going to show you, I have shown a couple of ways to make your code more readable. Labeling components, that's a big one. laying it out on the screen, and that's one of the slides I'll reshare. Because where it really becomes important is when you have a team of developers. We just talked about how when you go back and look at your code that you wrote 6 months ago, do you know what you did? You have to rethink it and go, what was I thinking? Right? Nobody disagrees, right? We've all been there. So spend the time when you have a team to put that extra emphasis on readability. It becomes more important, right? Very slightly more important. But again, it's going to make it harder to write. Now, I also have this, I don't know, maybe it's a passion, I don't know, maybe it's a personality flaw, but I don't like standards. Standards are rigid. They imply things that will never change. Now, when you're building an airplane, Kurt, you need standards, and they better have them, because that rivet has to fit exactly in the right spot or the plane will fall apart. But this is software. So I prefer guidelines. And we have this list. Some of you will remember this list, so I'll go over it again. These are what I call the foundational precepts of software development. And I, again, challenge you who have seen it before and those that are new. What's the most important precept on this list? Or the top 2 or 3?
I think I picked the consistency last time.
You did? Well, you all know which one I think is the most important. But how about for the new guys?
Me, it'd be functionality.
Functionality? I've always had that functionality first mantra. I think it's important.
If you don't deliver on a requirement, what are you doing?
Exactly. I agree. That's a good argument, yeah? Consistency. Yeah. That is the one I think is the most important, as some of you who were here last time know. No matter what you do, be consistent about it. Even if it's wrong, it's easy to fix. But the thing is all of these are important, and you cannot prioritize these. I've tried many times. So you have to keep them in mind all the time, best you can. And they may change in terms of prioritization depending on your use case and your team and your circumstance and your deadlines and so on and so forth. But don't forget about them. And I do like compartmentalization as well. In Talend, you want to create atomic units of work, not monolithic jobs. So, guidelines, not standards. It's really about good discipline, having good habits. Collect them and define them as a team, agree to them, and then adopt them. Document them in the software development guidelines document. And I did bring some this time. I don't know if I remembered them last time. So just take one of those and pass it around.
Oh, you did last time. I still have it on my desk.
Okay.
It only disappeared on my desk.
Really? Wow. So change it, modify it. This is just itself a guideline. But there's other good documentation that you can create. Your data dictionary is probably the next most important one you can have in a data integration team. If you're going to have an access layer or code modules, expand Talend through Java, then all those things should be well documented. So what are job design patterns? And I do drill down now into this with that new blog, but the first thing people say to me is, well, it's a template, it's a skeleton. It's, I create a base job that I can clone and then start building on that. And sure, I accept that. That is a job design pattern to a certain extent. It's templatized, but it's really more than that. It goes around that use case I was talking about. Is it a lift and shift? Is it a migration? Is it a command line? Is it a synchronization job? Is it an orchestration between big data and Spark? Every one of these patterns emerges as a generic way of doing things. And if you're going to have a pattern in your team for a certain kind of use case, then you should use the same pattern. What does that do? Makes it easier to read. Because that pattern is a lift and shift. Oh, well, I expect it to do this. And lo and behold, there it is. Now you just look at what you did to fill in the blanks. Okay? So the message here really is repeatable coding styles, reusable code, object-oriented code. This is Java code generator, right? So we can take advantage of that and leverage that and eventually achieve that easy to read, easy to write, easy to maintain mantra. Okay, it does give you a base for jump-starting the next project, and it's really where best practices come into play. So I'm going to touch on a few of the ones from last time, and then we'll dive into the next bunch. This one, number one, is how should I lay out my job on the canvas? Okay, and what do we not do? We don't do the zigzag. We don't do the snake.
After the first session, we improved a lot in our designs. So the day we came and we started development, I can see in entire my team, everybody is following very nicely. That's it.
So it's working. That's great. I would capture that quote, Drew. So this works, top to bottom, left to right. And I think I flipped through those too fast, didn't I? Okay, let's do that again. I don't know why it's not. Okay, well that's the zigzag, right? And that's pretty common. And like I've said before, when I started writing code, what do? I'm a good developer. I go out on Google and I search for examples. And the examples I found look like this. Zigzag the code within the constraints of my physical screen, not the canvas that I'm painting my code on. So great, I suppose. I can read it because it only has one serial flow, but it's very hard to maintain. You've got to go in here and change this code. If you're like me, I'm very ADD about this, very fastidious, I'm going to re-zigzag the whole thing. Waste of time. Complete waste of time. No benefit to that at all.
Re-zigzag meaning, no, take
Well,
that, turn it into your design.
Let's say I have to, if it's a zigzag, I got to modify, add something here, that's going to screw up the whole zigzag. So I'm going to.
I just change them, I top, left, to right. I'm doing that as I go into jobs. It takes a little time, but it's so much nicer.
Well, and when you adapt the top down, left to right, this is what I call the snake. I've seen one I call the web, which is something in the middle and it just spurts out like an explosion. The interesting thing is it impacts the Java code being generated, right? Strangely enough, because of the way you construct and link things together, it's going to have to generate that Java code somehow. So top to bottom, left to right, very straightforward, easy to read, easy to maintain. This is a key. Once I started doing this, I had the exact same experience. It took me 3 years to get there, right?
Adding a component in the middle is so easy.
It is. You can snip this, select it all, move it down, insert code, reconnect it. Done. 5 minutes. That's the point. Now, I'm okay with changing it up a little bit. This is a guideline, right? I will go right to left sometimes, like for error exception handling. You'll see an example of that, I think. And I might actually do the row processing top to bottom. But there, it's a matter of style and preference and use case. But this is the right way I found to lay out your canvas. I'm going backwards again. There we go. I saw just last week a unique, what I would call a reverse zigzag pattern. He started the bottom right and zigzagged up to the top. I'd never seen that before. Very creative. And so there's a new one. It's the reverse zigzag. Don't do that. I showed him this and he says, oh, okay, I'll change it. All right. Jumping to number 5, because this really should be number 1, exception handling. Don't ignore handling errors and exceptions in your code. So there's 2 bits to this. One is having a reusable code module. Typically, you're going to put that in a joblet, right? Put that joblet in a reference project so you can share it across all your projects. Capture with a log catcher component. Exceptions, Java exceptions, tdie, twarn, and our catch t archive failure. That's changed to tjob exception. So I've got to update my slide. This will allow you to generalize the way you handle all exceptions. So you don't have to have every job have its own log catcher, which I've seen many times. Oh, we're doing error handling. We've got a log catcher in every job. Well, what if you want to change the way that works? And you have 2,000 jobs. Well, that's a 3-month effort. Don't want that. The other piece, and this is where I have to open up.
Wait,
My-
that's the module that's reused in every job, basically?
Yes. Yes. Now this is just a sample, okay? So it's important to realize that that sample, while generic, does function. I had a customer take that sample verbatim and stick it into his job that was doing parallelization. And I didn't handle the fact in my sample that multiple threads could be writing to the same file, and when it's writing to a file, it has an open connection and it got an error, and he complained and said, your job split doesn't work. And I said, what are you doing? And he says, well, I put it everywhere. And I said, dude, just add a directory or a unique file naming convention, solve the problem. So just beware, it's a sample, but you can leverage it and change it and modify it and do whatever you want.
When is Talend going to start publishing those type of things already built to be downloaded?
Well, my team is making them available. All this code is available.
Like
That joblet, I can, sure.
It's on the website?
It's available. It's not on the website, but I can send it to you. No worries. All these sample jobs are available to anyone who wants them, right? So that exception handler needs one more piece of information, which is a practical return code or error code. I prefer the return code label because it's really an exception. Now, I can't see that over here, so I'm going to look for my mouse. There it is. Okay. So when you're using the tDie and twarn components, and there's another one called tassert, you're basically throwing exceptions within your code. Okay? When you do that, you have these settings available to you. A message, an error code, and a priority. Okay? Those priorities are industry standards, right? They're not guidelines, they are fixed. Log4j uses them, we use them, lots of companies use them. And yet we allow you to put in whatever message and error code you want. A lot of people just leave the defaults. That's an interesting log for your DevOps team. The end is near. What does that mean? Okay, well, let's do something a little bit smarter than that. So you see how these priorities, they're pretty much standard things. You'll find them in the ELK stack, right? So, a return code mechanism. I had somebody just discuss this with me on Thursday. And they had some return codes defined. But they were complaining that, there's too many possible return codes. I don't want to maintain 1,000 different return codes. I said, well, okay, you're putting a unique code for every error? He says, yes. I said, well, why not use a construct? So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a construct return code where I've got 3 parts to the number. The first part maps to the priority, the second part maps to the system, and the third part maps to the type. It dramatically reduces your number of return codes. He loved the idea. And this is out there on the internet. You can just go to help.talend.com and type in return codes. You can see how I'm mapping system to various things, network storage, file system, database, whatever. You can come up with your own list. And types of exceptions, open, close, read, write, get, put, dump, load, those operational things that make sense. And then you have a return code that's meaningful, like a 3605, 3 maps to, it's a warning, 6 maps to, it's a file, no, I'm sorry, 3 maps to info, 6 maps to file system, and 05 maps to open. So I can programmably determine that I opened the file successfully with a return code of 3605. As opposed to a 5701, which is an error on a database with permissions. So I have a credentials failure here, right? And I can test for return codes to be greater than 5,000, knowing that anything above that range is something I better deal with in my code. Alternatively, if it's less than 5,000, it's probably something I just want to log and take note of and keep processing. Okay? So those two things, having a generic log processor is what I call it, or exception handler, plus some meaningful return codes is a best practice. And it's really important to have that. And you want to build it in a reusable way so you don't have to keep writing the same code over and over and over again. Now, I pulled out naming conventions because you all know that naming conventions are a best practice, right? And I put this one in because everybody's asking me about parallelization. Because if you don't know it, then what you do is you parallelize your code. You don't want that. There's different ways to do it in Talend. Okay? We're going to look at those in just a minute. But I want to encourage you to use parallelization because it will give you an opportunity to optimize your code. But I also want to encourage you to do it very thoughtfully and very carefully because you don't need to make something faster that's already fast. You only need to address bottlenecks. Okay? Otherwise, and if you use too much of it, you create a mushroom cloud. Kaboom, right? Very easy to get yourself in big trouble when you start spinning up threads. On threads. Don't nest threads necessarily. Okay, so the execution plan is the first way you can do it. No code required. You go into the TAC. You create a task, wrap around your job, or several tasks. You can put them in an execution plan and enable parallelization right there. So let's say you have 20 tasks you want to run in parallel. Each task is mapped to a job server, one or more. So you can kind of distribute where these jobs are getting executed. Yet even that means that you have to fall within the constraints of the physical parameters of that job server. If it's only got 16 gigs and 20 jobs would require 116 gigs, you got a problem. So in addition to the checkbox, there's the threshold. How many jobs can I run at a time in parallel? Let's say it's 5. So, but your execution plan has 20. You fire off the execution plan, it launches the first 5. And as soon as one's done, it'll do the 6th, and so on. It'll just trickle down through the whole thing. No code required, just gets it done. Okay? So that is the first place where you can enable parallelization. And it's not a bad way to do it if you don't need to have any complex logic. But if you do need the complex logic, then you go back to a job and you create an orchestration job. Right? A top-level job that says, okay, I'm going to run these things in parallel. And there's a couple of ways to do that. The simplest way is on that canvas, you just write your flows and you don't connect them. Each one is its own starting point within the job. Okay? It's like synchronous, asynchronous processing, if that makes any sense. Okay? It's all in the same thread, and it's all in the same job server. But you might want to get even more sophisticated and say, well, why don't I, on each of those paths, use a T-run job to call another job and enable an independent JVM. If you were in the last session, you would remember that was a very important checkbox. So you can enable running your child jobs on their own JVMs, and you can effectively start up multiple threads, each having its own JVM. That can give you the same orchestration as the execution plan, but you can add logic to it. We also have components that let you do parallelization. The T-parallelize component actually lets you process multiple flows. And then we also have a suite of 4 components that lets you parallelize data flow. So if you've got 20 million rows you're processing, you've got your sub-job mapped out, you can throw in those 4 components, and you can split it into 5 threads, and in theory get it done in 20% of the time. Okay? That's a bottleneck. That's what you want to be able to do. Because they're components, you can catch errors, exceptions. You can also instead, on the row, right-click on the row, and you'll get a menu at the bottom. You can say parallelize, and it essentially implements the same logic or code into the Java without the component, which means it's more streamlined, more compact code, but you can't catch exceptions. So there's trade-offs. what you do is you start off with this, and if you really need to optimize, you pull them out once you've debugged it and right-click on it and enable the same capability. And then many of the database output components allow you to enable what is basically bulk loading. Multiple threads on an insert, update, or delete. Okay, if you're using Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, many of them support this. So you can improve performance. The recommendation is 2 to 5 threads, but as a developer you can play with that, and you'll get an exponential increase in performance in that range, but as soon as you go to 10 or 20, you might actually slow it down. Why? Why would it slow it down?
Database is not capable enough.
What's not capable enough?
Database.
The database? Well, database, if it's an Oracle, probably could. It's primarily because there's a cost to spinning up threads and managing them. So there's a threshold you have to find, a balance. And you will get a decreasing return the higher the thread count, depending on the record size, shape. Size and shape of data always matters.
Those components, if I remember right, like the T-partitioner and then the D-partitioner, is that where you can take, like if you have a 50 million, say you have a CSV with 50 million records in it,
Yep.
and it separates them so it can do 10 million, something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah, exactly. So that's exactly what you can do. You can determine A, how many threads to process that data set on, and B, what the partition key is. Right? Those 2 pieces of information, and you can have as many of those as your job server can handle.
And that's on the website, that
Yep.
sample concept too?
Yep, it sure is. Okay, enough of the past. Let's move forward, finally. I'm going to introduce to you what I call the database development lifecycle, and I've actually been noodling on this for about 20 years, so it's worked for me. Here we go again. Let's ask a question. A redundant one, I hope. What about my database? Doesn't it need best practices? And it's so often ignored. Everybody will agree with me, but then they just don't do it. So it's a rhetorical question because data models have schemas. So we need to track schema lineage. So we might want to do metadata management and all that good fun stuff because databases have a life cycle too. How does it work? Well, let's look at it from a data model standpoint. Okay? It needs to be able to, at any time, create a fresh install. Here's my current version of the database. Boom. Brand new, spanking new, empty. Maybe populated with some seed data or lookup data. I might need to take an existing database, 1.0, and upgrade it to 1.1, which is transformational. Maybe I'm truncating some data, maybe I'm adding some columns, some tables, I'm truncating some things, I'm doing some relatively significant transformations of the physical structure. Or maybe I'm doing a migration, which is a upgrade on steroids, where I have some real heavy-duty logic. I'm moving from Oracle to SQL Server, or SQL Server to Hadoop. I've got some really heavy-duty upgrades going on, so that's really a migration. It requires more logic to do. Maybe I'm splitting a 30 million table into 2 15 million tables. Lots of good stuff. So you have to be able to do that. So because of that need for handling these capabilities, drop, create, alter, adjust users, permissions, triggers, store procedures, all that kind of stuff, what I like to do is script my database objects. Yes, we all love these tools so we can have pretty pictures and we can spit out SQL code from them, and that's a good bare minimum. But script out object by object. One object, one script. I had a use case. I went in to a customer and they had an object model with 300 or so tables and about 80 developers. Half of them were in India, and any one of them at any time could change the schema, which in my mind is nuts to begin with, but that was their policy. So every developer would submit at build time a script with create table, alter table, create trigger, alter store procedure in one script, and there were dozens of them. Nobody could tell me what the current version of the database looked like. I'm not surprised. Nobody could tell me what the ERD really looked like. this is a problem, guys. And they were telling me that the size and shape of this data for their customers was so massive that a big name consulting firm came in and said it would be over 3 weeks for customers to migrate their data from version 2 to version 3. And they can't have the system down for more than an hour. So what does this software company decide to do? They start baking into their code checks to see, well, as the data gets migrated, do I search this database schema or do I search that database schema? Millions of dollars of software engineering on the table. I said, guys, stop, time out. First of all, we reorganized the structure, the table storage. It was Microsoft SQL Server. So the file groups were laid out better. That was a big problem. And secondly, we objectized one object per script. We figured out what 2.0 really looked like and what the upgrade was to 3.0, which I scripted. I could do a full conversion overnight. The customers could live with that. I don't even know how much money that saved this software developer. It was a contract, so I finished my job and I went my merry way. But this is really important, right? And that's a good reason why. Now, I'm a database architect, so I focus on the data model a lot. You probably hear me talk a lot about data models or my blogs on Data Vault and all that good stuff. But where did we get to today? How did we get here? How many of you know what a hierarchical database model is? I suspect you do. And a network data model, you remember those too, right? Okay, so I have a blog out here that collapses 50 years of data modeling into 3 paragraphs. If you're really interested to find out how we got to relational model and star schemas, and now even Data Vault. And when I say Snowflake here, I'm not talking about the company Snowflake. I'm talking about, Snowflake star schemas, normalized star schemas. But this is the process, the data modeling process. Understand your data. Where does that trigger? Data governance, semantic lineage, data lineage, metadata management. You model that data. And you go through that process until you're pretty confident that model is worth the trouble to validate that it's going to do the job. Once you've done that, you build it, deploy it, and test it.
So I'm surprised you don't have anything up there about a data dictionary.
Well, I mentioned it already, though.
But, so,
Good point, though.
there's quite a few databases that I work with. There's no data dictionary. It gets a little crazy to walk around and ask people, what the heck is this thing?
Yeah.
We have this thing, redundant data and things of that nature. It's just because someone got lazy and didn't want to answer.
Everyone is lazy. We are all lazy. Yeah, but I think you're right on point. There aren't enough data dictionaries out there, and I should call that out again here because I mentioned it as probably the #2 most important document you can create in your software engineering team. Second to this.
Well, it's a changing priority, as you said.
True. I talk about it in my blogs, right? The data modeling blogs, it's a 2-part blog. It talks about the history. I've pulled this from that blog. But data dictionaries can be generated, and if you import all of the schemas into your Talend job, you can generate a wiki. And that is a data dictionary, at least sort of. Me, on a real enterprise application, I will create a solid data dictionary. But metadata management, data governance, those things, semantic, and data lineage all should be encapsulated into that data dictionary.
Because if you want this thing to survive multiple generations of architects.
Listen to this guy.
Yeah, but that's all.
He's right.
That's why we want to know SQL, so we don't have to deal with all this.
No, but still, you should define what
He's being facetious.
But, talk about.
Right?
To a certain degree, but the fact that you're lazy, the example you gave where everyone just added things, well, that gives you free range to do it now.
I know.
No SQL. Just
I know.
create a new column.
Just create a new column, create a new table.
3 new columns every time I go to that table.
Yeah, the customer I worked for just before joining Talend did an inventory of their databases. They had 364 databases. They had customer information in 75% of them. because, different applications teams decided, well, I need, customer name and address and phone number.
Because back in the 80s, we tried to do development around the sun. 24-hour, passing time zone.
Yeah.
And because people didn't know, they started creating they had rights.
Mm-hmm.
What was an efficient database became a dog.
Yeah, so that's where database architects come in and not database admins.
Back in the 80s, we would have really chucked everything.
Yeah, well, and here's the guy with some experience. He can tell you. I bet you got plenty of horror stories. Yeah, all right. So I take this to the next level, which is the modeling process. Now you're probably all very familiar with the logical and physical layers. Who's going to tell me the difference between a logical model and a physical model?
So logical model is basically it's a business to business connection with entity to entity, and the physical is coming into the table and column level.
Okay, so the physical is really, well, I call it the SDM, the schema design model. That's how you lay it out on the physical disk based on your host system. The tables, the indexes, the keys, the triggers, all those important physical attributes which will change depending on your host system. The logical layer is those business entities and attributes. Most companies stop here.
Isn't the DBA responsible for the physical layer?
DBA, well, he's over here somewhere. Yeah.
Data administrator,
That's his role, absolutely. But he should work together with the data architect to lay that out. It's a team effort at that point. The logical layer is getting it ready for designing the physical. I got to be careful not to touch the screen. Okay. So just your standard entity, and I call it the ERM, just to make it fun, instead of the ERD, but it's essentially what it is, entity relationship diagram. Conceptual layer, however, is very interesting because I've had several debates with peers and customers about, well, isn't the conceptual layer the same thing as the logical layer? I say no. Who disagrees with me? Who wants to debate that? I'm ready. Conceptual layer is the information model. This is the layer your business users understand. Because it's people, it's products, it's HR systems, it's financial systems, it's all of the information that your business user can understand. They don't know what entities and attributes are. Some of them do, but this is the layer you communicate to the world.
So that's typically the functional organization speak.
Yes. So UML is a great modeling language for that type of diagram. Okay, is this making sense?
Yeah, I know about the conceptual layer, but I think it's a lot of work.
Yeah. Become a database architect and get employed, gainfully employed.
Community to use this actively and engage. If you don't talk their language, they're going to tune you out in 30 seconds, their eyes are going to glaze over, and then they're going to build some disaster and access, and then you're stuck.
You've been there too, obviously. He's laughing because with a knowing laugh. I've been there too. I mean, if all you do is this, you probably don't get it right the first time. I mean, but if you do this first, you probably do get it right the first time. That's the difference. So there's a cost factor. One of those hidden ROIs, it's hard to do, and it takes time and money, and there appears to be no value or return, but let me tell you, there absolutely is at the end of the game because you build a better data model, and you only have to fix it once.
in my organization, we're slowly going away from the conceptual layer because that's a cost that Agile doesn't justify.
You can do Agile here.
No, you just can't justify the people that do that.
Yeah,
They're not producing code, so they're going away.
Yeah, I get it.
I have a question.
It's a pendulum.
Yeah, and
Where are you on the pendulum?
Yeah,
Why are
so,
you on the Agile team if you're not coding? Out.
Yeah.
so the question is, that if you have, for example, not design a whole new database, I just want to add something to a database.
Yeah.
You don't have a conceptual layer because it's all thrown away a long time ago. How you, and then it tend to happen that team not going to do that conceptual layer? And who's going supposedly to provide it?
Well, the information architect should do this. He's there. This role is right here.
Information architect, first time I heard about this name.
Oh, it's a very highly skilled, highly paid role that some companies who value their data. I just had this conversation with a customer this week. Data as an asset. Everybody will agree that data is an asset, but who's willing to invest in that asset?
Not many.
Not many. This company is heavily investing in their data as an asset. In fact, all they're really focused on is data quality right now, because they know that if they get that right, everything else is going to be easier. You get this right, this is going to be easier. And that's why I've introduced the top layer. I call the holistic layer. And this is really only appropriate in an enterprise where you have many data silos to address that very problem that you describe. When you have a big company with data everywhere, 300 different data silos, you have to grapple with it. You have to understand, at least holistically, where it all is. So if you do this first, you don't have to have all the physical details. You understand where the data is first, and then it's easier to abstract and extrapolate the conceptual layer, and then it's easier to define your ERD, and then you can physically lay it out, and guess what? Suddenly it becomes relatively agile. Data modeling has never been an agile thing.
What is this like? So,
What is this bubble chart and this holistic layer? Like, just roughly give you an idea. I get
I'll
all
show
the
it to you.
stuff for that one.
I'll show you. Okay, so,
Can you go back before you go forward? I know you
Yeah.
answer his question. Would you,
there it is, yeah.
would you wrap that and all that metadata?
Absolutely.
You would, okay. I would take issue at the conceptual level as the information architect.
Okay.
Because if you are a third party and you are building an application for someone, that would not be someone talking architect type language, they would be talking business type. So that would be like business.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you at all on that.
yeah.
And you would want an information.
From a software vendor, if I'm building an application, I would want this internally.
right.
But I wouldn't use it to communicate anything. I wouldn't even tell my customer anything about
Working for
this.
a software company, you would rather have it on your side. because
Right.
It's called billable hours. and family.
There we go. There you go. It's true. Well, actually, we'll probably engage one of our partners, our SIs, to do it, right? Because we sell tools, right? So this,
The bubble chart
yeah.
is, so let's say in my business, the question is, where does it all start?
This is what a bubble chart would look like.
So you might have the customer in the middle if you're customer centric, and then you're able to breathe out, well, he's got a meter, he's got energy that's given to him, it's brought by power, it's fueled by.
That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about in the holistic model. Yeah. This guy here, I found the hub of the business. In this case, was a vehicle. It's an auto parts retailer. Everything is around the vehicle. Year, make, and model. Boom. That is my core business in the business. Everything fans out from there. So I found all the other data silos, parts and labor, demographics. This is a holistic bubble chart. And in my blog, I talk about how to construct it. My engineering manager, I did this on a contract, he looked at it, he says, oh, I love your flower chart. But it worked. It allowed me to fully understand the entire enterprise without having to go into it in detail.
What tool do you use for that?
Visio. Tool of choice.
I would push back and say, the car is not the middle, because if you were here during the 80s, they were building cars and moving them out to the parking lot and declared victory.
Well, this,
No one bought them. So the next evolution was talking about the revenue source.
sure, well, it's all about the business and the use case. This business is an auto parts retailer.
But still, they're going to focus on what generates revenue. They're not going to be.
And what generates revenue for an auto parts retailer? Auto parts and mechanics need to know how the construction of the BOM of a vehicle is. So yeah, everything boiled down to a year, make, model, or make, model, year, sorry. And by the way, this extra little bubble around the bubble, that is identifying itself as an ontology. This is where you need an extra layer of meaning for searchable information, ontologies and taxonomies. So not every bubble has one, but I have a couple of places where I've identified a need for ontologies. I'm not defining the ontology, I'm just defining the fact that I need one there. And that's where you can get into technologies like OWL and RDF and triple stores and Lego graph and smart logic, is that it? Semaphore? There's just a lot of technologies out there that let you build ontologies and map not hierarchical searches, but compositions, which goes right into the information model that you need here. So here, this bubble here are these actually 4 tables in a conceptual model, which breaks out to these, 6, 7 tables in my ERD, which now becomes a physical model down here. So that physical model represents just a small set of this, and I think one other section. And now because I understand my holistic landscape, I can add something to my physical model, and it's already been designed to accommodate it. Because I knew about it up front, even though I didn't implement it yet, through the design of the model. So this is what I call the DDLC, right? The life cycle of the data model. The only real relationship to Talend is that Talend is a data integration tool, and mostly what we do is deal with databases and models of data. So this is a step outside of Talend as a product, and it's something that I felt was an important thing to talk about. Hopefully that's a good answer.
That merge with others, if they have this, their value of selling goes up exponentially.
Exponentially.
Because someone can finally understand what they're getting.
Yeah. And your business users can pretty much understand this.
And the first thing I do when I have to do a talent job that deals with a database that I haven't touched before is I ask for that.
You asked for that, and you should.
Send that to me. I want to know your whole database, not just the 2 tables I'm dealing with, because I need to know.
And I don't care if you use Visio or ER Studio or whatever, it doesn't matter. Just
Get it every time?
Sometimes it takes weeks. I'm
do you get it at all?
Yeah. We're pretty good about that.
Okay.
But I do. I want that whole model if I'm going to be touching the database.
As
Even
you
though
should.
I only want me to do 1 table. I still want to know.
As you should. Now I'm going to come back to your call out because maybe I just need to move it up in the slide deck. Create a data dictionary, please. It's very important. If you're going to deal with your data models of whatever size and shape they are, make sure you document them. Create a data dictionary.
The other thing you might want to add is what is indexed and what is not indexed.
Yeah, I just put the fact that you have indexes down here.
I can't, where did you point?
Unique, non-unique indexes, clustered, non-clustered.
Yeah, because you can go after something that's not indexed.
Yeah,
Spend
it's
hours.
hours. These are the kinds of things that I put into my data dictionary every time. That's a lot. And again, you'll get these slides, so you don't have to memorize them. You don't have to.
Just nailed it. I asked her if she had one because she has a model for it, and they don't have one. They're too busy.
They're too busy.
It's true, though. Isn't it?
It's
we
true.
run a big shops.
So do we. I get it. Okay, so it's part of the JEP book I haven't written yet, but in terms of software development lifecycle, there's 3 states. There's strategic, which is your preferred state. You want to be working on strategic stuff. Then there's tactical state, which is all the stuff you got to do to get it done. And hopefully, best practice is you're doing both of those at the same time. And if you're doing both of those at the same time, then your tactical work might actually fold into your strategic work because you know what your strategic value is, and sometimes it's throwaway.
Yeah, I know you're talking about to do the important thing, most important thing, urgent thing, but
You have to get things done. You have to produce business value, so that's tactical. But then there's the third state, which I call firefighting mode, which is the worst state. Organized chaos, disorganized. It's the worst thing you can do. If you've got a fire drill like Mike had to go down this evening, he's missing out because he had to go deal with a fire drill. That's the last thing we want to do. So it's the first thing you put out. Put out your fires. Get rid of them so you don't have them. And if you do it tactically and strategically, you should never have them again. Right? Very important.
Once you get to the firefight, right, you're so busy fighting the fire, you're not addressing strategic and you're not
Yeah.
addressing the
And there's other things to consider. You know, obviously scalability is huge. And I'm not just talking about your software, but your team. Your team has to be scalable. How can your team be scalable? Well, you want to be able to do things, create content that's reusable. Talend effectively gives you that on the software development side, which is a much more scalable approach to writing code than hand coding, which a lot of us prefer because, you know, that's where we came from, right? We loved writing code. I knew this painting your code thing was coming 20 years ago, but I was resisting to it. I didn't want to learn Informatica.
Well, how many of us are paying out code, right, to address this big issue at every time, and we don't automate it because we don't have time to do it, even though that would
Yeah.
buy us tons of time.
It's a catch-22, right? So yeah, it's a vicious cycle, and get out of the firefighting mode as soon as possible. Put all your energy into putting that fire out. Get it out and never see it again, because now you can focus on tactical and strategic, and that should be part of your agile methodology. You should always in your sprint have both tactical and strategic efforts underway. A lot of people will say, well, we'll just do tactical because we have to get things done, and we'll wait on the strategic. Guess what? You will never be strategic that way. You'll only be tactical. And you'll be firefighting every other week because you don't have anything strategic. Okay, that's my soapbox on DDLC. Let's get into some Talend best practices. Okay, are we good to move on? All right, number 17. This is pretty cool because Talend is a code generator, and we have all these wonderful components that we can drag and drop on our palette, from our palette onto our canvas and hook them together, and whoa, generates Java. Well, maybe it doesn't do enough. Maybe I want to create a Java routine that will do something special, like parse a string in a certain way. In the repository, project repository, there's a section called code. Expand that out to routines, and you will actually see some existing routines. The one you'll see there is called system, and I've expanded that out. Guess what? You're already using them. If you've ever used any Talend functions, you're using code routines that we bake into the product and ship with the product. But guess what? You can add your own. Why not? The trick is to make sure that when you go in and you open up your Java module, that you include the comment section, because that is converted into your helper text. So we're actually using that function. It pops up a little bubble area that describes the function, its syntax and its purpose and example, all that good stuff. If you don't put in the help text, there's no help, because that's effectively what that is.
So, for example, almost every job I open has date logic in a T-Java, and they're all different, and they're all trying to do the same thing, and they're all written by someone else. So that would be a good thing for this.
Yeah, we give you a set of date functions, Talend date.
Right, but then we always need to do different things.
So you create
Write
your
it all
own
differently.
version of Talend date. A good example, not on date, but okay, there's one in there called sequence that will incrementally give you a new integer value. Pretty cool. I needed a long. So I copied the I copied the sequence method, renamed it to sequence long, changed the data types, and now I have a new method to give me an incremental value that's a long rather than an int. These are all extras, come on. you got to do some work, show your value, right? So
When you upgrade your system, is that there or is you have to override something?
these become metadata objects embedded in your project. So, and when you're connected to a source code control system like SVN or Git, all metadata is maintained, not just the Java code. So if you write a code routine, it gets saved in your source code control tree. So when you upgrade, it comes too. Now the tricky thing is if you wrote a module on, let's say, Java 7, and then you've moved up to Java 8, you might need to double check that it still works in Java 8. Or, more importantly, you might find a better way to do it in Java 8, and you want to replace it. Now when Java 9 comes, you'll have the same. Java 10. I think they're skipping 9, aren't they? Yeah. Yeah, 10 is out, but yeah, so I don't know when we're going to support 10, but 8 is pretty solid now in the industry, but that's the kind of thing you want to look for. Okay? So you're using these functions already, more than likely. Okay? So the panel on the left, the project repository, has a bunch of stuff in it. That's where you create your job designs. That's where you create your joblets. That's where you create your context variables. But there's also this section called metadata. Are you using it? Yeah? Okay, you got some great things in here. You can create your database connections in here. You can create all your metadata mappings to all your different file layouts. You can even connect to things like LDAP, Salesforce, Snowflake is now in there. And you've got these things called generic schemas. I use generic schemas a lot because I may have a table called accounts with 12 columns in it, but because of my data processing, I now added 4 more. So I need a schema that defines those 12 plus the 4. Or alternatively, I have a table with 60 columns in it, and I only need 5 of them. Right? So you need to create generic schemas and put them here in the project repository because it makes them reusable. If you do it within the job, it's built into that job. And yeah, it's reusable within the job, but it's likely that you're going to use that schema in another job. So put it in the project repository and reuse it from there.
Not only that, when you need to do the impact analysis, if it is built in the job, you'll never be able to.
You'll never be able to find it. And if it does change, you change it here, it propagates the change across everything. So promote it to the project repository and use these things because they're very helpful. And have a naming convention. I call it GS underscore for a generic schema. Ooh, that was simple. But that's not the object. MD underscore account data is the object. That's the metadata. So that's where I came up with that. Actually, I didn't come up with the MD. I came up with the GS, though. MD is pretty much, when you create one, the default is metadata. And everybody's lazy, and you'll see a lot of generic schemas out there called metadata. 20 things called metadata is not very helpful. Give it a name, a purposeful name, and put an MD underscore, or whatever naming convention you like. Whatever it is, be consistent.
Talend should by default populate the name of the schema what we are giving at the first minute to the metadata.
Talend could do that. It needs a customer entering a support ticket requesting that feature. Okay. We actually added a lot of new features in 7 from customer feedback. A lot. All right. So I talked about error handling, exception handling, logging, right? So there's 2 kinds of logging available within Talend. We have fully implemented and embraced the Apache Log4j capability, which means that by default, if you go under your project settings and you'll find the Log4j menu item and you click on it, you will see the Log4j abstract XML showing all of the different appenders, they're called. You might, if you look closely, notice that several of them are commented out. So you have to be deliberate about your log4j logging. You can turn on or off appropriate appenders, and you can format the output of your technical log based on log4j syntax. Now, I'm not a log4j expert, so I can't tell you what that syntax is, but there's lots of good documentation out there to figure out if you want to change the way the appender writes the information in the log, formatting, style, information, all that can be adjusted. By turning it on, by default, all of that information will get logged to the Logstash server installed on your enterprise infrastructure, okay? Which means you can use the ELK stack. Elasticsearch, log server, Kibana UI. Now this is what I refer to as the technical log, because what happens is every component you put in your job is log4j enabled. Now you can turn it off just by unchecking that thing, but leave it on because you actually have, and you'll see on the next slide, the ability to control it. Okay? Notice it also uses those Talend priorities, info, warning, error, fatal. Now on the server side, in the TAC, what you do is you enable log4j at the task level. If you remember, or if you know, the task is the wrapper around the job that you create in the job conductor. This task wrapper identifies all these little bits and pieces about how you want to execute that job. What context you want to run it in, what job server you want to run it on, and in fact, what level of log4j logging do you want? So in a dev and a test environment, you probably want it set to info. That's a lot of information, by the way. Customers say, my log file's huge. Well, in production, do you really need that? Probably not. So the best practice would be in production to set that to at least error, if not fatal. If you've done a really good job testing your code and checking this stuff out in dev and test and your cycles there, you can adjust that task in production to at least error, if not fatal, which dramatically reduces that log to just produce critical information that your DevOps team may need. Okay? And using the Kibana UI, you can search and navigate through all those logs. And again, this is what I call a technical log because it's tied into every single component. Now, we also have the activity monitoring console. This is your operational log. This is programmable, right? Remember we talked about the tDie and the twarn components. There's the other one, the tassert component. And we talked about return codes. Okay, first thing you do is on the studio, you go back into the project settings, and under job settings, you'll see stats and logs. There's a lot of flexibility here. I've turned on to say, yes, track statistics, track logs, and track volumetrics, display it on the console, don't write it out to a file, but do write it out to a database. So all of those messages and return codes get written out to a database that you configure. There's 3 tables in it, the stack catcher, the log catcher, and the flow meter catcher. They're very simple. It's an optional install. You have to actually go to the installation guide and read up how to install it. It's really simple. Create a database, run the scripts, and create the tables, and then turn it on. Okay? And then what you get, and actually it's true on both the TAC and the studio, but I'm showing it on the TAC, you get a visualization of your job. Now this is pretty nice. I've selected a particular AMC, I've selected a particular task that ran. I can see that this green task was the most, and I click on it, I see which one it was. That took the longest to execute. And lo and behold, here's my messages and return codes right down here that I programmably invoked or threw as an exception in my job design. So these are programmatical. These are operational logs that you control. So definitely something you should think about using and incorporating into your development guidelines.
What's the benefit, for example, a case, a real quick case that you use, for example, you can see what's abnormal. What will abnormal show up in this picture?
Well, that depends on the return code, right? So in these return codes, I'm seeing 3708s, There's a 3709 and a 3705. My error message is giving me more detail. The 3709 says this database source DV table was created. Okay?
Yeah, that sentence, right?
No, but I can check in my code after I created it, was a 3709 invoked?
I was saying another component.
Another component can test. You can use the run if. You can use it in an expression. That return code can be tested after returning from a T run job. So there's lots of ways you can use this. Another case is that if it's like a 5701, or let's say anything in the error range of, you can test if I run a job, a child job, and I get a return code of anything greater than 5,000, maybe I don't want to continue, but I don't want to bail out. Maybe I want to programmatically do something to correct the situation and try again. So you can do it programmatically. That's the whole point, is that by implementing this, you can do that. Now, one more option to answer your question is, okay, so all this is getting stored in a database. So let's say we're triggering these 5701 errors, which are the login credential errors. You can implement an external tool like Nagios to run a SQL query every 5 seconds or every 10 minutes, whatever you want, looking for particular error codes. Like running out of disk space. If you've got warning messages in there that disk space is low or memory is being consumed, you can have external systems monitoring your job execution for exceptions that you've programmed into them.
Who will in the company mainly do this type of job? Sounds like DBA equivalent to in the data.
I would throw some of that work on the DevOps team. It depends on how you structure your organization, but it has to be, these guidelines have to be, a collective agreement. It's not just for you, it's just for everyone. In stakeholder, if you're doing Agile and if you've got a Scrum team, pretty much everybody on the Scrum team needs to know what's going on.
Is there an overhead to having that functionality?
There is, as you might expect. There is an overhead, but here's the nice part about that overhead. Again, I think that, I went back too far. Hang on. Where's my extra slide on it? Hang on, let's see if it paints up. Boom. I have to be patient with my slides sometimes. No. In the task, when you go into Job Conductor and create the task, just like the threshold setting you can have on the Log4j, you can set the same kind of threshold setting on the AMC. You can also disable or enable it. In fact, another one that's really interesting is the statistics, okay, because that's different than the log catcher. Statistics are going to give you all the execution times for all your components. Now, clearly, that is a lot of overhead, but by default, components are disabled for statistics. You have to deliberately go in and turn them on. I kind of wish that was the default, that they were on by default, because in the TAC, you can disable them with a single checkbox. And in a production environment, you would want to, because you don't need that overhead, and it can be as much as 10, 15%. So great information during your test and debug and your development lifecycle portions, but once you roll out into production, you want to cramp that down and optimize your performance by not enabling such a robust logging on both the Log4j and the AMC. And if you really have a throughput problem and you've done all the optimizations with parallelization and everything, then just turn it off. It must not be that important. How are we on time, Drew? Do we care? Okay, I'm going to try and go a little faster. How about?
7:58.
Okay, I don't know what time we were supposed to end, but if you're all game, people can leave when they want, right? Number 21 is recovery checkpoints. You guys understand what that is? Okay, when you write a job, and let's say it does 10 things, and it takes an awful lot to complete 10 things. And if it completes 9 things and then fails, what do? Do you rerun all 10 things again? Oh my God, that'll take me 3 weeks. Or do you just run the 10th thing?
We run the 10th thing.
That's what you want. So how do you do that in Talend? Well, you set up recovery checkpoints. You set up a checkpoint by going to a on subjob OK trigger, right-clicking, and enabling a recovery checkpoint by giving it a name. Take a checkpoint right here. And the Talend job will write the code in Java to capture that point in time so it remembers where it was the last time it executed successfully. So if the very next thing failed, it would be able to restart from that point forward.
Well, there's a double-edged sword, so,
It sure is.
because you might begin to question yourself, did I get all the data with the first 9 ones as opposed to the 10th one, and if you just go back to that 10th one,
Absolutely.
you'll learn the hard way.
So as the developer, you should know what those ramifications are and what cleanup efforts are required in order to continue. In which case you write those instructions down here.
I'm glad you didn't use the word reasonable guess.
Yeah, no. You need specific instructions because if I want to pick up after step 9, but I have to delete this file, truncate that table, do a little bit of setup to make it continue, which is a hell of a lot easier than rerunning 9 steps again, you have to instruct the DevOps guy on what to do, or the DBA, whoever it is. Okay? Now, that information is critical because otherwise when he restarts the job, or she, it might fail again on step 10 and make things worse for the very point that you're suggesting. So, on the other side of it, in the TAC, remember there's 2 sides to this, right? The studio and the TAC. And you can't do any of this, by the way, in TOS, right? You have a place in the job conductor to specify the recovery method. Okay? Normally it's called wait, which now this gets a little more complicated because remember a task is running on a job server. And if a job server goes down, right, you may want the job to just keep running once the job server comes up again. That's what wait is. Or you might want to set it to recover task, which means it's going to, for whatever reason, whether the job server went down or the job failed, the job stopped running, right? And you want it to recover, which means you can open up the error recover management screen, find the error, read the instructions on what to do to continue processing, follow those instructions, truncate that table, delete that file, rename something else, and manually spin it up again and let it continue processing. Okay, so it needs a little thought. It needs a very deliberate understanding of what you're telling it to do. But this is the manual recovery.
What does wait does?
Hmm?
The wait, what is this? What is it?
The wait? That's when, if the job server is unavailable for some reason, it will wait. It'll just stop and idle. The job's fine, but the job server's physically gone away.
Is that the default value?
Yeah.
Even in the middle of the job also the job will wait?
Yeah. Yeah.
How does the JVM will open? JVMs have already killed.
I don't know how it does it underneath the hood, but that's what wait is supposed to do.
I was running a series of jobs, and then for some reason I got disconnected from the database. But it looked like the job was processing.
It's just probably in an idle state. If the job server it was running on is down, it's going to wait until
No, the database was up, I just got disconnected.
database. You lost a connection to the database,
Yeah,
but it's about the job server. I'm talking about the job server.
right, but still you want to be able to tell the user, hey, this thing is spinning in that direction.
Because your DB
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
That's an error because your DB is not able to connect.
Never got an error. It was just spinning and spinning, and it was, so I used code. And it
Yeah.
tells you how long the job was processing. I mean,
Well,
So you-
some of that information you can find in the log4j side because you'll see that it stopped logging information about component execution.
so
So that's part of it. The AMC is going to tell you,
I looked at my code, and said,
yeah,
I've run this 100 times.
but this is about the job server.
Yeah, but still, it's
Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah.
Someone's got to alert you by saying, gee,
There is a way to set up notifications and alerts, okay? There's a way to do that. Plus, you can programmatically add some value there in your generic log processor to look for that kind of thing. But then there's another option here, which is to reset or restart the task. Okay, now you're dealing with a case where it can actually automatically pick up where it left off and keep going without any manual intervention. So the reset or restart, and I have to look at the manual again because those two words are a little confusing. You know, they almost could mean the same thing, but one of them means start the job back from the beginning and rerun the whole thing. The other is pick up where you left off, the known good point, and keep going.
Would you want to log off the system and log back on?
Depends. Depends on what your job was doing. So yeah, possibly. That's why you have to put some thought into it. So frankly, the recovery checkpoint is a fairly simplistic feature with a very dramatic impact and that requires a lot of thought and planning. All right. Okay, so we've looked at joblets because we've introduced this log processor. But I want to call out that that is not a typical joblet. Right? It's not typical for two reasons. One, it doesn't have any inputs or any outputs. And it has a green background. Do you remember what the green background means? It's an entry point. All right, so it's a listener. That means this thing's going to start first, okay, and start listening for exceptions. But it is a joblet, which makes it reusable. That's a good thing. Typically, however, joblets have input and output parameters to pass data flow or process flow through. And they would look more like this. Here's a sample that brings in a schema. So data is flowing into this. I've set some values previously to calling this thing, or excuse me, embedding this. It's like inline code. It does the update, continues the process of passing the row back out, and away it goes. So I can use this joblet in line. So I have a parent job that is processing data, and I can stick this in the middle of my data flow, and it will do the update and come right back out and keep processing. And I've thrown in a little component error to catch any exceptions. Now these input and output elements, they're not exactly components, can be either data flows or triggers. So you can either connect a data flow to it, you can connect a data flow out of it, or you can connect a trigger to it. And what I mean by that is non-subjob okay, on error okay, on any of those triggers, any process flows. You can go in and out, and you can mix and match. You can come in with data and go out with a trigger. You can come in with a trigger and go out with data. You can have just an inflow and no outflow. You can have no inflow but have an outflow. But obviously those two scenarios have ramifications on your job design. Typically this is what your joblet might look like, because it's going to perform a repeatable piece of code. I use this particular one inside my Data Vault tutorial in 4 or 5 places within a single job, because I'm updating the state of my job, which is another mechanism for recovery checkpoints. If you think about stateless versus stateful application development, this is a state engine, and I update the state. I'm processing, I'm starting, I'm finishing, I'm working on it, whatever the state is, so that at any time if the job fails, I can have my job be smart enough to look up, well, what was the last state that the job processed? Oh, it finished step 9 okay, but I never saw anything telling me it did step 10. So that's the kind of thing that you can implement there. So this is a more traditional use for joblets. Now I have also seen joblets, very complicated joblets, that really were the job design, right? And had a very little job that called this massive joblet. No, that's really not effective. That's not efficient. That's not using the purpose of the joblet. The joblet is to create reusable code, not your job. Create your job in your job and reuse modules as needed using techniques like T-run job and joblets. In fact, it's true, I think, to say that joblets really effective joblets are rare. I don't see a lot of joblets in a well thought out project. Some, yes. Maybe a half a dozen, I don't know, but not hundreds. Just doesn't make sense. There's something off when I see lots and lots of joblets and very few jobs. Things are backwards. It's like that backward zigzag. I'll use that one again. Okay. Oh, and there are some things that you don't want to do in a joblet. It won't prevent you. I'm not a big fan of putting database connections in a joblet. I have seen some and had some argument or debate around, well, why don't I create a joblet to initialize my database connections? You can do that, but it's tricky. The one that I really don't like is using JavaFlex. Have you guys used JavaFlex component before? Okay, so you know there's 3 Java components, tjava, tjava row, and tjava flex. Well, it's flexible. What the tjava flex does is it puts a wrapper around your complete data flow, your cycle of processing your data set, which gives you a start, a body, and an end. And even if that Java Flex is like 5 or 6 components downstream in your subjob, it's going to put that wrapper right at the beginning of the subjob. So if you've got a joblet in the middle somewhere and it's using Java Flex, it's going to create nasty, nasty Java code. You can probably get it to work, but I don't like this idea at all.
So tjava flex gives you a benefit of the tjava row and the tjava.
Oh, more than that, it allows you to basically capture every row by row, and say, okay, now that I've got this row, I want to do something about this row. So think about how would you parse a cell in a spreadsheet? If your data set was 2-dimensional, you'd need a Java Flex for that, right? Now, on the other hand, if the Java Flex is self-contained within the joblet, that would probably be okay. In other words, the beginning and the end is all managed within the joblet. That should be okay. I would question whether it's purposed right for a joblet, but maybe. Anything's possible. Alrighty, next one. We introduced component test cases a few releases back, 6, so it's been a year plus. It's not exactly unit testing. It's component testing, which is still very useful. And what it is the ability for you to take a component, not all, but many data processing components. If you right-click on it, you'll see a new menu option that says Create Test Case. And it will actually generate what looks like, and in fact is, a job. But that job is just that component with some wrapper code around it. And I'll show you that in a second. And what you do with this is you have then a subordinate job to your main job for that particular component that you can execute as its own independent jar file. And you pass in data and it writes out data, and you can compare that data against an expected result. And you can automate all that through Jenkins. Okay? I think it looks like this. And it's a pass-fail kind of thing. Here we go. So here's that component from my parent job, which should tell you a couple of things. That you can create multiple test cases for both the same component and for multiple components in your job. So you can create a suite of test cases to test your functionality. And again, what it does is it creates and reads a temporary file, passes it in to the component, which writes it out to a file, and then it does a compare of your expected result with the actual result. And it either passes or fails. You throw an assert. Yes, it matched. No, it didn't match. Sometimes you want to test for a didn't match, and that's a pass. So you determine the pass or fail. You can actually feed in many input files to the same test. So you can test small, medium, and large, good, bad, or ugly. You know, you can really try and break your code And this becomes a nice set of regression tests in the end. So it's not exactly unit testing, but it's similar in concept. Okay? Any questions about this?
When you have a new component adding to the process and you're wondering whether it works and you're doing this.
You can. And it's a repeatable test, right? So you can put it into your automation script using Jenkins. If you're using CI/CD, it becomes part of your build. It's a separate jar file that Jenkins can invoke, test, and check the result. And you have a threshold setting. Did I pass 90% of my tests? Then yes, promote it to the next environment. Or if you're going to production, it has to be 100% pass. So you have different techniques that you can employ. By creating these test cases, you now have a body of tests that you can run and automate the execution of to ensure that any changes that have been made to the code since the last time you ran the tests still work.
Would you also use it for performance testing when you do large? No.
No, not really. I mean, you've got the other capabilities with T-statistics to do some benchmarking and stuff. Heading out? Yeah. All right. Thank you for coming. Good to see you again. My pleasure. Drew, you're going to have me back. Part 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know. We're almost there. I'll keep going for whoever wants to stay.
So Talend creates this test case job or?
Yes, it does generate that job for you. Just by right-clicking and saying create test case, it creates that code. Uh-huh. Oh, and I should say, I should point out, you see this green box? This is important, this green box, don't change anything inside that green box. If your schema changes, don't change it here. Change it in your job. It will propagate the change, right? But this logic outside, you can change. This is what it generates. But you can change it if you want to make it a little more sophisticated. All it fundamentally has to do is pass in data to the component, write out the results, and compare the results. Pass or fail. As long as it does that fundamental logic, you can change anything you want outside of that green box. Okay, I want to get through as many of these as we can. What's going on here? Come on, give it, there we go. Oh, I'm going backwards, that's why. How many times have I done that tonight? All right, 5 at least. Okay. Number 24, data flow iterations. Okay, and this, I think most Talend developers get this, but when we read data, we're processing a stream, essentially, of data, the result of all the records. So we might read 100 records, 1,000 records, 1,000,000 records. Whenever we have a row connecting something, it's basically processing all those records. Now, yes, under the hood, eventually it's doing it row by row by row, but it's treating it as a full flow. There are times, however, when you need to catch a row and process against one row at a time. That's an iteration through the result set. Some components actually allow you a trigger to iterate. Not all of them do. Many of the database input ones have them. So I can say, go read 1,000 rows and process them one by one. But oops, tmap, you can't connect an iterate trigger to it. So you have to physically change it to a flow. So we have a component called iterate to flow. Now what's interesting about this, because the iterate is upstream, it's going to pass one row at a time into the tmap. Huh? Sure, it's going to hit performance, but you're going to get value out of it because you're going to get to do what you need to do row by row. Now, let's say downstream, you've finished your map, you've logged it, but boom, I now am parsing it further. I need to split that one row into an iterate function. I can split a flow from a flow to an iterate and create an iterate within my flow. So you can go from flow to iterate and iterate to flow with these two components. Some of the database components give you iterate functionality. The loop, T-loop, gives you iterate functionality. So you can improve the job design if you use things in the right place at the right time.
Do you know the acronym REBAR?
I've heard it, but I don't remember what it is.
By agonizing real.
Yeah, okay. It's been a while. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what we're talking about here, yes.
It was helpful in Cassandra though, because you could pass in a partition, and instead of, when you flow through your partitions, you actually would just get any, whatever the records are in the partition and moving through. So we kind of did that as an optimizing technique.
Yeah, yeah.
Can we have a very, very basic scenario? For example, like what would be good scenario? Okay, just excuse me. For example, we have, like, say, 10,000 rows.
Okay.
And then I want to, the first one, what's the first one's function? I want to put into some iteration to become a 10,000 row. I want one row per file. So try using this?
You could.
Or what else is a better example?
Well, that's not a bad example. If you want to take 10,000 rows and iterate through them right out to separate files, you need to manage the fact that the file name is changing. So you'd iterate through a T Java row that changed the file name and then output. And it would do it 10,000 times and output 10,000 files.
The bottleneck for this kind of process is like how fast.
Performance is going to be a hit, absolutely. So functionality first, then optimize for performance.
So this is more focused on kind of like the loop, more like the loop.
It's more like a loop. It's really about traversing that loop and controlling
Yeah.
the iteration of that traverse.
Very intuitive that I want to do this iteration. This is the component.
If when you need it, there it is. And there are times when you need it.
Using it and you want it all the time, right?
One more good thing with this, that iterate you can parallelize.
Yeah, you can.
You can parallelize how many.
Yeah, you can. So that's why I always say functionality first.
File, right? 10,000.
Yeah. Is that a real use case?
No, if it was, you would.
Yeah.
That would be a great
Oh, yeah, you could. Parallelize.
parallelize.
We all do it. We call it parallelize, and that's the worst thing you can do to your code, right? Okay. That's number 24. Let's do 25. Woohoo. Oh, I like this one. This one's fun. TMAP. The most common component in Talend is TMAP, by far. We know we have got the stats to prove it. There are more TMAPs out there than any other component worldwide. So, the default is read data in, look up data, and do what you're going to do on your output. The default is, in this scenario, is read all that lookup data into memory first, and then start processing your result set. That's fine if your lookup data fits in memory. But what if your lookup data is 200 million rows? What if in those 200 million rows, your lookup sequence or logic might actually only touch 10 million of them? That's a horrible scenario. You don't want that default. So what do? You consider the lookup model. And how you do that is when you go into the TMAP UI, you normally will see this. Load once, unique match, left outer join. That's the default. That's what's going to load it up into memory. And based on your join definition, you're going to get your left outer join result set. But it's going to look up 200 million rows first. Map it out, away you go. But there's another way. It's called the load once versus reloaded each row. That's what I'm looking for. Reloaded each row is a different lookup model. Now there's a reloaded each row cache, and that'll make sense to you in a minute. So here's a scenario where I'm bringing data into a TMAP and I'm doing a lookup on potentially billions of records in that table. And I'm only looking for one row. Let's say I've got 10 million of those billion coming through here. I really only want to look up that row if I find it, if it's there. I don't want to preload 10 billion records into memory. So I use the reload at each row mechanism. I go into the T-map, and I change the lookup model to reload at each row. Now, suddenly, it will not read the whole thing into memory. Instead, it will immediately start processing the row, and it will do the row lookup one at a time. But there's a trick. The first part of the trick is in the T-map, you must, and you'll see when you change the reload at each row, you'll open up this expression builder where you create global key maps. Okay, so you're going to define a global variable that will contain the current value of a key in that row. In my case, I have two. I have two values that will provide the relationship between my incoming result set and my lookup table. Okay, so every row comes in, I save the values at row by row, I use those values to do the lookup. So the other part of this is in the lookup query. Okay, so now I go to my lookup SQL syntax, and I include in my where clause a join condition for where my key equals my value of that key from tmap, which is stored in a global variable. So I'm using the get map or the global map.get function.
So this is a sparse lookup in data stage, exactly the similar.
Yeah. The global map.get function is a very powerful thing, very useful in this case. So this is one you want to get to know. All right, so what I've done is I've defined what the key is in the tmap. I've used that key in my where clause. I could use it on an inner join or a on condition, a from with on. But as long as I'm matching those keys, I'm going to pick up that row from my lookup based on that key value. Both have to match, and I think I did set it to unique match. I'd still set it to left outer join. You can play with those and you'll understand what you get.
Huge performance on large.
Huge. Okay, so there's trade-offs. The lookup in memory is going to be very fast, but it's going to look it up into memory first, which could take a little time if you have enough memory.
Your incoming data is only 100 or 1,000 per day. You can always do this key if the table is indexed with that column.
Yeah, one of the things I like to do is I like to look at my joins. I said, well, would it be better for me to process the 100 million rows and then look up the 10,000? Or process the 10,000 rows and look up the 100 million? So, and knowing that I have these different lookup models, it depends on the use case, right? Yeah.
Can we load, for example, I have a billion row, can I roll a 10,000 row at once? Truncate that way?
Only by reducing the where clause condition.
Reducing.
If you've got 100 billion rows and in your lookup table you only want to load a million of them, you need a where clause to reduce the set to 1 million rows read. Because what you're asking is, can the database chunk the data back to me? And no, it can't unless you program it to. This isn't a Talend thing, that's a database thing.
Right, but can I process, because the memory issue, can I load, you right now load row by row and generate a global key?
Well, that's what we're talking about. You're either going to load it all into memory or you're going to load it row by row.
Only two options.
Well, there's the third option, which is the load row by row with cache. Let's say of those lookup records, your incoming result set may find the same record. So that record you looked up might be reused. Okay? Lots of times. And you want to set it to row by row with cache. So the first time it looks it up and saves it in memory. Then the second time it needs it, it finds it in memory, so it's much faster. But now your memory will grow, right? For the more times it has a match that wasn't already in cache, so you have to be aware that you're consuming memory, and you might be right back to where you started from and get a GC heap out of memory error.
For a while I thought I'll open a support ticket how to do sparse lookup in Talend. I never explored that. I saw that it is there, but never used it.
This is a great thing. So yes, it's going to be slower, but it will be more efficient, and there's trade-offs. Like anything else, it's trade-offs, right? Okay. let's plow through the rest of these. Global variables. In Talend, you can almost call everything a global variable. Global to what? It's about context, isn't it? Right? So, we have context variables, right, which we define in the job here, and those are global to the job. We also can, and those are predefined, we also can at runtime in the job use the set global var component to create one on the fly, and now that's global to the job. Okay, they can either be built in or in the repository as far as the predefined ones. And guess what? You can use that global map.get method again to retrieve its value.
Why would you use that global variable versus just a tjava?
You know what? That's a great question I've been asking since day one. And there's a couple of places where I have used the T global var, and it's where I dynamically had to define it. And that's the only clue I can give you.
One limitation with global var is you can only define the string data types. The global var, you cannot
No, I've defined dates before. Integers, yeah.
I think it will only give you
The string represent.
it doesn't give you anything data type.
I'd have to double check for you. I'd have to double check for you, but I've used it to capture a max date value, but it might have been a string. Yeah, I may have had to cast it. Yeah, I may have had to cast it, yeah. So our friend, the big data friend left, but there's a similar component on the big data side. It's named slightly differently, but it does the exact same thing. So that's a map reduce job. Okay, but there's more global variables. Let me just, there we go. I'm going backwards again. Look at that. That's why that's happening. Bing, bang, bong. There we go. So inside your tmap, you can reference global variables. So here I'm writing an expression to determine my join using a global map.get for a value that I've stored in a global variable. Okay, inside an expression, inside a tmap, so that's something you can do. And there's a whole bunch of system global variables. Now these are global variables that are available at runtime, typically after a component has executed. So if you've ever gone to the outline tab and click on any component, you'll find it over here, and these are the available global variables. I found out something myself just the other day that I didn't know about, which is Java, if you look at the Java code, there's actually more variables that are defined and used within the Java code that technically you can expose and access. However, that's not really a supported feature, so beware. These guys were having a problem. They used this internal global variable, and it wasn't maintaining consistency, and it wasn't behaving right. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. They didn't know why. I said, well, what's your variable? I said, well, wait a minute. Let's see, is it on this list? No, then you shouldn't use it. But we looked at the Java code, it's there. I said, yeah, but this is object-oriented programming. You don't know whether it's consistent. Its value is consistent depending on the way they wrote the job. It wouldn't be, but that's a different subject. Okay, so any one of these components will have these system global variables, which you can use and incorporate them into messages and test with the run if and whatever you want to do. These are some of the, I don't think it's a complete list, but some of the kinds of things that you can test for. I like the number of line rejected, inserted, updated, deleted, how many rows were processed. I used to write my own incrementers, but you don't have to.
I got a very nice problem with that feature. So I've been using number of rows from a Oracle input or my
Output, it would be an output,
and
yeah.
I'm putting in a run if it is greater than 0 and doing some work. So I changed that to from SQL Server to MySQL.
Oh, yeah, it's going to behave
That
different.
changed from TMSSQL input underscore 1 to TMySQL underscore 1. So when you call the global map, it uses that value. And
Yep.
it took me for a while to figure out where it is
Yep.
getting errored out, where it is getting errored
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, you want to use it right after. So some of the things you might want to do is right after one of those, save it to your own context variable, right? So that you can use it downstream, right?
Right, because it can change depending on what happens.
Well,
right?
but it is specific to the component. So log row 1 has its own error message and number of lines. Log row 2 will have its own.
If you remove that log row and you add another log row, and name will change from _1 to _5.
It will.
And then all the values will change.
It will. So be very careful because everything has to be a unique name. Oh, there's 2 more neat ones. I use them in my logging. In my pre-job, I log the project name and job name on both my start and my exit of my job. So these 2 are available just generally. Only 5 more. Okay, so you know about these context variables and the groups and stuff that you can define in the repository or built in. And when you create them, they contain default values. Maybe they're blank, maybe they have some value. You can override these values in your code. You can overwrite these values in the task definition. But you can also load them externally from a file or database and overwrite those default values at runtime using the tContext load. There's even a tContext write component, so you can save the settings. So maybe you read them from a database, write them to a file, so all your jobs can read them from that file, and then delete the file at the end. If you've got security concerns, there's a lot of tricky things that people can do. But the important thing to note is that you can write your design pattern to load those context value defaults at runtime.
What is the context group variable?
What is a context group variable? We'll take that offline. I'll explain it to you. If you haven't used them, it's very, very neat feature.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
I am his assistant.
Okay, then you tell her. You haven't trained this girl right. Okay. 28. Dynamic schemas. I can't tell you how many times a customer has said, I have 300 tables and I need to write 300 jobs? Really? Can't I just write one job? They're doing the same thing, they're just different schemas. I'm reading from an Oracle table, I'm writing it to a SQL Server table. Why do I have to write 300 jobs? Can I do it in one? Well, the answer is no. You can't do it in one. But you can do it in 2. Is that good enough? And it's by using the tset dynamic schema component. Okay, and this particular job, which is part of the sample I can send you, runs. Successful. It reads from MySQL the information schema. It says, get me all my tables. And then using a tJavaFlex, it says for each table, go read all my columns for that table. And then it constructs, it checks for length to be null, and it constructs that schema and gives it a name, an object name at runtime. Here's my schema that I've just read for that table. It saves it as an object name that I can now use on another query. Query the SQL Server database using this schema structure and write it out to, and this is the caveat, to a positional output file. It must be positional. Now that you've written out your data to a positional file, all you have to do to load it somewhere else is kind of do the same logic and reverse those 2 components. Read the positional file based on that schema and write it to somewhere else. You could probably do that in the same job, but that would be like bad job design. Write 2 jobs, one that does the dump, one that does the load. Now this is based on some knowledge of the information schema, right? You know what that is, the information schema? On the DB, right? And the nice thing is when you do it this way, you've got some settings in there to actually play with the data types a little bit, like truncate strings and a few things that you can do. Because the alternative is, we offer a suite of actual components that will go out and get you the table list and the column list directly. So it's a little less code here. You don't have to know anything about the information schema. You just use the MySQL table list component to get your list of tables. You go out and you get the list of columns, and you see iterate, and do the same kind of thing, and away I go. But I have no more control here to adjust the data types. I can only process the table and column list. And again, same thing. Reverse the secondary process loop to do the load. So you have two ways you can do that. And we have these table list and column list components for almost all of our databases. Oracle, MySQL, Microsoft, Postgres, they're all there. So if you don't want to dink around with the information schema, you don't have to.
It's a great way to get all the info off the database with a simple job, isn't it?
I use these jobs to read the TAC database. Boom. Yes, exactly. I call it the dump load pattern with dynamic schema. Pretty cool. Okay, we're almost there. Thanks for sticking around. I appreciate it. I don't even know. To me, it's 5:40. Okay, CDC comes up a lot. Do we have to do CDC? Yes, especially when you're loading a data warehouse. Very common. We support CDC in Talend. There's all the databases that we support CDC for, and it is essentially trigger-based, right? Each host database provides CDC triggering capabilities, so we enable them with the TDB CDC components. So pick the database of choice, and you can run with it. It's essentially a publish-subscribe mechanism. Very common CDC practice. It basically, every time a record changes, it fires a trigger that stores the change, and then you can pick up that delta on the other side to update your downstream process, typically a data warehouse. In particular, we have 3 different modes, and this is right out of the documentation. I think they prettied up this diagram. It's the User's Guide, Chapter 11. I don't think that's changed. There's several pages on this, so you can go find this out. The trigger is the default. You can also use the redo archive log if you've got Oracle 11G or beyond. Oh, I'm sorry, before? Yes. Or the Xstream with Oracle 12 on OCI. So these are the things that we support in CDC. So does Talend do CDC? No, Talend doesn't do it. The database does it, but we expose it and let you bake it into your process flow.
So on the trigger, though, where is it writing its data?
Wherever you want your database to write it to, because it's the database trigger that's doing it.
Right,
You configure that.
insert it into a staging table?
It probably is going to be into some kind of a staging
Kinda like
table.
Symmetric DS.
I don't know symmetric DS, but yeah, that's pretty much what it's doing.
So would there be any plans for like Postgres redo law or the logical log reader and all that?
You're asking the wrong person on that one. Open a ticket, request a feature. Product management, I'm sure, has looked at that one. I don't know if it's on the roadmap. Postgres is a great database, but frankly, there aren't a lot of users on it. So it probably explains why that feature isn't available. We are customer driven, right? And we have a lot of customers on Oracle, a lot of customers on SQL Server, a lot of customers on big data, and we're cloud first now. So Postgres is, again, it's a good database, but it's just not widely used. So it's not getting a lot of attention. So unless we have a really important customer, not that they're not all important, but you know, size and shape of deal is a driving factor. I'm sure you can imagine why. But I'm sure they'd be happy to build it for you if you're going to pay them to do it. But I would first check, of course, to see if the feature is on the roadmap, because it might be. I don't know. I don't have visibility into that kind of stuff. Just 2 more to go, ladies and gentlemen. With over 1,000 or more components shipped in the product, Sometimes it just isn't enough. I want more, more, more. So there is a Talend exchange, exchange.talend.com, where third-party Talend enthusiasts have built their own components. And they're available to you. They're published on the exchange, and you can download them and add them to your studio and use them.
I want to know who's making the most money. That's
We don't make any money on this.
You don't charge like
No.
Apple does and take a vid?
We do not charge on this exchange, but we do not support them either. We have taken some of the components off the exchange and did a deal with the author and brought them into the product. That we have done. But these are just another pool of third-party components that are available to you. If you can't find it in our palette, go look here.
Like, is there a cost to some of them?
Yeah, some of them will charge you a little bit of money, so they'll support you. Right? Fair enough, right? Some of them want a donation. Some of them are just straight up free. We'll put out some that are preview components that aren't ready for shake and bake yet, that will go out on the exchange first, so you can get people to use them, play with them, give us feedback, and then we'll GA them later on. Now, even with our 1,000+ components, and even with the hundreds and hundreds of third-party components, sometimes that's not enough. More, more, more.
Do you evaluate these third-party components
Do we evaluate them? No.
before we use it?
No. No. I know many people within Talend play with a lot of those components. But yeah, you're on your own. At least, yeah, at least they're there. I should have mentioned that in order to plug them in, you go to your Preferences tab, you go to Components and specify a directory folder where they're going to go. And then as you download them, you can download them and have them in a library. They're not installed yet, so you can then do an install. So it's a two-step process. And that gets it all baked into your studio. Now, every developer who's going to use that needs to have it installed in their studio. So what happens? The first person that does it gets put into their studio, and it gets saved in the library repository. Now, typically, that is a Nexus. Okay, so that the next studio developer comes along, it'll get pulled in from Nexus if he's opening the job that has that component in it. Okay?
They don't need to re-download.
They don't need to re-download, but they do need to reinstall it on their studio, but it's already there to install. Because it's a studio-specific plugin to Eclipse. Okay? So only if they open in the job that has that third-party component will they be prompted, hey, you don't have this in your add-on plugin directory, and you'll install it, and there away you go. Okay. But you need more. So build your own. We have now two ways you can build your own component. The way that's been around for the longest, which 90+% of those third-party components are built with Java Jet framework, which is a framework around Java. Okay, you just Google Java Jet and you'll find all of its syntax. So you can create a component based on Java Jet yourself to do very specific functionality. Now, I've seen companies who will build their IP in a component and then use that component in their job flow and then they sell that as a product. They can totally free to do that. Talend gives you a component builder perspective. As of, I think it's actually 7, we've GA'd the framework, the new Talend component framework. It actually may be 7.1. We'll have to check that. It's available now in pre-release, but I think, yeah, the GA is later this year. This is a framework for building components that's pure Java. So you're not limited by the constraints of the Java Jet framework. And the nice thing about that is you can build a much prettier UI. You can really do a lot with your component.
We get to this, you were saying it's in 7.1, is it?
This one, no, this is, I pulled this screen out of 6.2.
Where can we go?
This is the component framework. Well, yeah, to download it, you go to the Exchange. I have to see if I can navigate. I've got my studio open. We can navigate to it. But it's out there. It's adding a new component. Oh, and you can find it on the help, talend.com. Just type in custom components, and it'll point you directly, and it's documented, right? So you can get to the documentation. There's a tutorial, in fact. There's even third-party YouTube videos out there.
Yeah, there's some really good tutorials.
There's some good material out there on building components. Okay, and yeah, so the component has this concept of a begin, main, and end. So they're optional elements, and you can turn them on or off, and you can, select English or French.
Or Chinese.
Yeah, it looks like it. And then essentially what you do when you construct the framework of the component, it's XML based. And this interface lets you go in, and this is all our interface to the JavaJet XML interface, and you can go in and turn things on or off. Things like, do you want to include this feature, that feature, that you're already used to and familiar with in most Talend components anyway. They're just switches that turn things on and off on the UI. With the new framework, it's changed. And I haven't seen the exact builder yet, but it's all open Java, so you should be able, we've called it tcomp internally, and it should be available this year, later this year. Last one. You guys are diehards. I'll go all night, but you guys stuck this out. I appreciate it. Okay, this is also the last pretty cool thing that most people don't know about. When you open up the studio, you've probably clicked on the code tab. You all know the designer tab. Have you clicked on the code tab to see the Java that it generates? And no, you can't edit that Java, right? But you can see it. Have you ever noticed this JavaScript tab and wondered what the hell that was?
When I opened Joblet, I was able to see the JavaScript.
You open any job, you can see the JavaScript. This is what it looks like. XML. Guess what? That JavaScript tells everything Talend needs to know about the job and how it constructs the layout, the components, the triggers, the attributes, everything that's in the designer is stored in XML form in JavaScript. That's interesting. That's a flat file, right? What if I knew about how to generate that JavaScript? That's even more interesting. And yes, I can copy and paste this, save it to a file, modify it, suck it back in, and create a job. Now that's even more interesting. What if I use some kind of metadata-driven tool that keeps track of all my schema lineage, schematic lineage? Couldn't I write an engine that generates jobs? Code generation, folks. Because under the hood, JavaScript is the job.
Is that what we export when we do an export?
It's part of it, yeah. The Java gets exported too.
Yeah.
So, as an example, case in point, Yale University, which is a big Talend customer, they also have a big data vault model. Their data model changes all the time. And they're constantly adding new data sets from different parts of the university. They didn't want to have to write job after job after job, and dynamic SQL or dynamic schema didn't really work, because what they really wanted to do was map one structure of the schema to a completely different structure. So they created a template model based on the source and the target and generated JavaScript. They could basically turn the crank every day and generate all their jobs, soup to nuts. Open them up in Talend, build them, deploy them, execute them. So anytime anything changed upstream, they just turn the crank, regenerate the jobs, build them, deploy them, and execute them.
In the JavaScript.
By manipulating and generating JavaScript. So what you can do, if you're interested, you can play with this. Go to one of your jobs, open up JavaScript, copy and paste it out to Notepad. Change something. Don't change the structure. Change a message. Open it up back in Studio as a new job. Your change will appear. Not a very efficient way to make job changes, but you'll get the idea of what's possible.
How do you get it as a new job?
Oh, you just open it as a file. It's a simple way to create a new job. You just bring in the job script. Yeah. Okay. There's also instructions in help.talend on how to do this. So it's pretty cool. We have several customers doing this kind of thing. Can a job be generated? The answer is yes. And JavaScript is the key. Now, frankly, what they did at Yale was pretty impressive, and it took a lot of work setting up the metadata. But once they did that, it was all the other part of the work was building that engine that generated the code, and that was productized by our partner, and they sell it as a part of their service. So it's very cool. All right, so I'm just about done here. Some of you have seen these slides before, but let's be practical. If you're going to build any software, make sure you have a foundation, a use case, you're picking the right technology, and you have a methodology. And now we've introduced DDLC to add to your SDLC. Those are methodologies. You got to have all three things. And of all those foundational precepts, my mantra is at least be consistent. Do it wrong the same way. It's easier to fix. But pick it, and it doesn't mean that you can't change. It's agile. So if you're going to be consistent, then you can change and adapt much easier as well. And some of you know the answer to this, so let me ask the ones that haven't seen this question or who forgot. What does Pablo Picasso mean by this quote? Action is the foundational key to all success. What does he mean by that?
Max with the system.
Say again?
Just play.
Just play?
Yeah, start using it.
Whatever we learn, go and apply.
Do it, right? I think that's what you're saying. Just get it done. Stop talking about it, do it, right? Sort of, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, just play. I like that
Go
answer.
break.
Yep. Yeah, you can get yourself bogged down by talking and talking and talking until you're blue in the face. But you need to just get it done. And remember, guidelines, not standards. You want to build jobs that bend so they don't break. And I think, yeah, this is the last slide. Yay, touchdown. This is my set of do's and don'ts. And I'm done. Take any other questions, of course, and hang out for you guys if you want to talk about stuff. But that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.